Ramesh thought driving a taxi through quiet Australian streets would protect his marriage, but when Pooja's hidden pregnancy exposed a devastating betrayal, the man known for patience and sacrifice began a journey that would end in irreversible violence. Ramesh spent most of his life behind the steering wheel of his taxi, navigating the wide streets of an Australian city that never truly felt like home. He had arrived years earlier from India with little more than a work visa and a promise to himself that he would build a better future. His days began before sunrise and ended long after midnight, filled with airport runs, silent passengers, and the constant pressure to earn enough money to survive. Every kilometer he drove carried the weight of responsibility, not only for himself, but for the family he had left behind. Back in India, his marriage to Pooja had been arranged in the traditional way. It was a union built on trust rather than love, strengthened by family expectations and social duty. After the wedding, Ramesh returned to Australia alone, promising that once his finances improved, they would live together. Months turned into years, and those promises grew distant. Their connection was maintained through brief phone calls and occasional messages, often interrupted by poor signals and exhaustion. To those who knew him, Ramesh appeared disciplined and quiet. He rarely shared personal details and avoided social gatherings. Other drivers saw him as reliable and hardworking, someone who never caused trouble. What they did not see was the loneliness that followed him everywhere. Long hours on empty roads gave him too much time to think, and the silence inside the taxi often felt heavier than traffic noise. Ramesh believed sacrifice was part of success. He ignored his own emotions, convincing himself that patience would eventually be rewarded. He trusted that distance would not damage his marriage, and that loyalty would survive separation. At that stage, he had no idea that the quiet life he was living was slowly leading him toward a future he could never have imagined, one shaped by betrayal. Pooja's life in Australia was very different from what she had imagined before marriage. She lived in a small rented apartment, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and a culture that felt distant and cold. Ramesh worked long hours, and his absence left her days empty and repetitive. She spent most of her time alone, watching the city move outside her window while her own life felt frozen. Calls with her husband became shorter, often rushed, and sometimes days passed without any contact at all. The loneliness slowly began to affect her thinking. Without family nearby and with no close friends, Pooja struggled to find purpose. She tried to keep herself busy with household routines, but the silence always returned. During this time, she met a man from the neighborhood who noticed her isolation. He offered help with small things and showed interest in her well-being. At first, his presence felt harmless, almost comforting, a simple escape from isolation. As weeks passed, their interactions became more frequent. The attention she received filled an emotional gap that had been growing for months. Pooja knew she was crossing a boundary, yet she convinced herself that it was temporary and without consequences. Guilt followed her constantly, but it was quieter than the loneliness she felt each night. She continued to hide this part of her life, believing secrecy would protect everyone involved. Her marriage began to feel distant and unreal, as if it existed only through memories and expectations. She avoided deeper conversations with Ramesh, fearing that honesty would destroy what little stability remained. The emotional distance between husband and wife widened, and trust quietly faded without a single argument or confrontation. Pooja did not realize that every silent decision she made was pushing her life toward a dangerous direction, one where consequences could no longer be controlled or undone. The discovery came during a routine medical visit that Pooja had delayed for weeks out of fear. When the results were confirmed, the reality settled heavily on her mind. She was pregnant. What should have been a moment of joy instead filled her with panic. She immediately understood the danger of the situation, knowing the child could not be Ramesh's. The truth felt impossible to face and even harder to hide. Her daily life changed overnight. Anxiety followed her everywhere, turning simple tasks into overwhelming struggles. She became cautious about her movements, avoided familiar faces, and limited her time outside. Medical appointments became a source of constant stress, each visit reminding her that time was moving forward and secrets could not remain buried forever. She dressed differently, ate differently, and lived in constant fear of being questioned. Pooja tried to convince herself that she could manage the situation alone. She considered many outcomes, but none felt safe. Telling Ramesh felt unthinkable, as she feared his reaction and the shame it would bring to both families. Ending the pregnancy carried its own emotional and physical risks. Doing nothing seemed easier, even though it meant allowing the problem to grow larger with every passing day. Meanwhile, small changes in her behavior did not go unnoticed. Requests for money increased without clear explanations. Her voice during phone calls sounded tense and distracted. Ramesh sensed something was wrong, though distance prevented him from understanding what it was. He felt an unfamiliar unease that lingered after every conversation. Pooja believed silence would protect her until she found a solution. Instead, it isolated her further. The secret became a heavy burden, affecting her health and judgment. Each day brought her closer to a moment when the truth would surface on its own. She did not realize that this hidden pregnancy was... Ramesh's return to Australia was sudden and unannounced. What began as a feeling of unease had grown into a constant pressure he could no longer ignore. The distance that once felt manageable now seemed dangerous. He told himself he needed answers, not confrontation, but clarity. From the moment he arrived, he noticed changes that confirmed his fears. Pooja appeared withdrawn and nervous, avoiding eye contact and offering vague explanations for simple questions. The home felt unfamiliar, as if something hidden lingered in the air. Over the next few days, Ramesh quietly observed everything. He noticed unopened mail, unfamiliar numbers in phone records, and medical documents that had been carelessly placed away. Small details formed a pattern he could not dismiss. The realization came slowly but with crushing force. The truth revealed itself not through confession, but through evidence that spoke without emotion. The pregnancy, the timing, and the inconsistencies made denial impossible. Ramesh felt his world collapse inward. Years of sacrifice, loyalty, and restraint suddenly felt meaningless. Shame settled deeper than anger, striking at his identity and pride. He worried about how the truth would reflect on him within his community and family. The betrayal was not just personal, it felt public, even though no one else knew yet. Instead of reacting openly, Ramesh withdrew into silence. He avoided emotional responses and focused on control. His thoughts shifted from confusion to calculation. He replayed every memory, searching for signs he might have missed. Sleep became difficult, and his routines changed. The calm man who once accepted hardship without complaint began to harden internally. What frightened him most was not the betrayal itself, but the loss of certainty. The future he believed he was building no longer existed. In its place stood a question he could not escape: how to reclaim dignity in a situation. Ramesh's thoughts became increasingly narrow and focused. What once felt like confusion settled into a cold sense of purpose. He convinced himself that order had to be restored, not through exposure or public confrontation, but through control. He stopped asking questions and started watching patterns. Days were spent studying routines, timings, and habits, noting when Pooja left the apartment, how long she stayed away, and which places she visited most often. The act of observation gave him a sense of power he felt he had lost. His emotions flattened into something distant and mechanical. Anger no longer came in bursts. It stayed constant, steady, and quiet. He began to justify his thinking by reframing the betrayal as a deliberate act against him. In his mind, the situation was no longer complex or emotional. It became a problem to be solved. He isolated himself from coworkers and avoided phone calls from family, fearing questions he could not answer. The man connected to Pooja slowly vanished from her daily life. Ramesh's influence was subtle but effective, using pressure and fear rather than open threats. Pooja felt the shift, but did not understand its source. Her world became smaller, her support weaker. Ramesh watched this happen without hesitation, believing isolation was necessary for what he considered balance. Financial arrangements changed, and Ramesh began moving money in ways that suggested preparation rather than survival. His taxi hours decreased, replaced by long periods of absence that could not be explained by work alone. He practiced patience, telling himself that rushing would only create mistakes. Inside, he believed he was reclaiming dignity. Each step felt justified, even logical. The idea of consequences faded, replaced by certainty. He no longer saw Pooja as a partner or even a person, but as the center of a broken system that needed correction. This mindset removed doubt and replaced it with determination. By the time he felt ready to act, the night everything changed arrived without warning and without witnesses who could explain what truly happened. The apartment complex remained quiet, with lights switching off one by one as residents settled into sleep. Inside the small unit, the tension that had been building for weeks reached a breaking point. Nothing appeared unusual from the outside, yet events were unfolding that would soon shock everyone connected to the case. Late that night, Pooja's phone activity suddenly stopped. Calls went unanswered, and messages remained unread. For someone who usually responded quickly despite her stress, the silence was alarming. Hours passed, and no movement was reported from the apartment. Neighbors later recalled hearing faint sounds earlier in the evening, but dismissed them as ordinary household noise. By midnight, the building was completely still. When morning arrived, concern grew. A neighbor noticed the door remained closed far later than usual. Authorities were contacted, and emergency responders arrived to force entry. Inside, they found Pooja lifeless. The scene suggested intention rather than accident. Objects were displaced in a way that pointed to planning, not chaos. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing valuable was missing. Medical responders confirmed her death at the scene. The pregnancy immediately became a critical factor, turning the situation into more than a domestic tragedy. Investigators secured the area and began documenting every detail. The apartment felt controlled, almost staged, raising questions about who had been there and how calmly the event had unfolded. News spread quickly through the community. What had seemed like a private marriage quietly dissolved into a case filled with shock and disbelief. The silence of the night now felt heavy with unanswered questions. Someone had walked away while leaving behind a scene that would demand justice. That single night did not just end a life. It exposed the investigation moved quickly once authorities confirmed the death was suspicious. Police focused on timelines, digital records, and recent movements connected to Pooja's life. Phone data revealed a sudden gap in activity during the night of her death, followed by a pattern that suggested someone else had access to the apartment shortly before communication stopped. Financial records were reviewed next, uncovering unusual transfers and withdrawals made in the days leading up to the incident. Attention soon turned to Ramesh. His unexpected return to Australia and recent changes in routine raised immediate concern. Surveillance footage from nearby streets and public transport showed him in the area on the night in question, contradicting earlier statements about his whereabouts. Taxi logs confirmed he had not been working during the hours he claimed. Each piece of evidence added weight to the suspicion that this was not a crime of impulse, but one of preparation. Forensic teams examined the apartment in detail. The lack of forced entry suggested the victim knew the person who had been there. Items were arranged in a way that implied control rather than struggle. Investigators also uncovered evidence that Pooja had recently been isolated, with reduced contact outside the home. This aligned with the theory that someone had deliberately limited her access to support. Ramesh was taken into custody without resistance. During questioning, he maintained silence, offering no explanation for the inconsistencies found in the evidence. His calm behavior contrasted sharply with the severity of the situation. As the case became public, media outlets revealed the hidden affair and pregnancy, triggering intense discussion across communities in both Australia and India. The trial that followed was long and closely watched. Evidence was presented step by step, forming a clear picture of how events had unfolded. Financial records, surveillance footage, and forensic findings left little room for doubt. The court focused not only on the final act, but on the weeks of preparation that came before it. The pregnancy became a central part of the case, symbolizing how deeply the situation had spiraled beyond control. Ramesh showed little emotion throughout the proceedings, maintaining the same controlled silence that had defined his actions after the crime. The verdict confirmed what investigators had already concluded. Ramesh was found guilty and sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. The decision brought legal closure, but it offered no comfort to the families involved. In India, relatives struggled to understand how a man known for patience and sacrifice could commit such an act. In Australia, the case became a stark example of how isolation, secrecy, and unresolved anger can escalate into violence. Pooja's life was remembered not for her mistakes, but for the tragedy that ended it. Her story highlighted the vulnerability of those living far from support systems, trapped between cultural expectations and personal struggles. The unborn child became a silent presence in every discussion, representing a future that was never given a chance. As media attention slowly faded, the impact of the case remained. It served as a warning about the dangers of suppressing emotions and allowing resentment to grow unchecked. What began as distance and misunderstanding turned into a permanent loss that no punishment could reverse. The story ended with prison walls and unanswered questions, leaving behind a reminder that revenge, once chosen, destroys far more than it ever claims to restore.